This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome to this mental coronavirus question and answer session, and thank you for joining us today. The contents of this webinar do not purport to provide any financial, investment or professional advice, and nothing in the content of this webinar shall be deemed to constitute the provision of financial, investment or other professional advice in any way. Today we'll be answering questions on the government updates, furlough and specifically returning to work. I'm Helen Easton and I'm joined by three of Mental specialists. I've got Nick Sorrett and Edwina Redhead representing employment law and Pete Nichols for health and safety. All of you are on listen only mode at this moment in time, but you do have the opportunity to interact with us by asking questions via the Q&A button within the Zoom app. We do try to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can during these sessions, and we do use all of your questions to update our FAQs within the coronavirus area on Mentor Live. Nick, from an employment law perspective and just for general knowledge, I'm going to come to you first and ask you for the latest news on sectors that should prepare for lockdown, and specifically, anything sort of differences between England, Scotland and Wales.
Yes, thanks, Helen. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for taking the time to join the webinar. To answer your question, currently, as at today's date, across the whole of the UK, the only additional premises that may open really are garden centres and plant nurseries. Cafes and restaurants may open to serve takeaway or home delivery food and drink, but not for any sit-down meals, either inside or outside. Now, in terms of future plans, and this is where it gets more complicated because the different countries within the United Kingdom are proceeding at a different pace. England has the most detailed plan yet, and I'll set that out because the other countries are sort of following, albeit a little behind that plan. The next key date in England is Monday, the 1st of June. Originally, this was set out in the Prime Minister's plan that some non-essential retail could begin to open. Well, actually, the only non-essential retail that's permitted to open from Monday are car showrooms and outdoor markets. Nothing else is permitted to open. The next date, I understand, is that dentists in England may open for non-emergency treatment from the 8th of June. Obviously, that's a bit of a niche issue. And then the next key date for employers and businesses is going to be the 15th of June, when we believe that non-essential retail may be open. So that's other shops in the high street that are currently ordered to close. Final thing we know about England is that hospitality and leisure, so this is hotels, cinemas, eating indoors, won't reopen until the 4th of July at the earliest, and we don't even know that for definite yet. Any reopening may well be phased. Hopefully we'll get further announcements nearer the time. That's England. In Scotland, as I say, outdoor activities such as garden centres, and they also include forestry and that sort of thing, can reopen as of today. They're allowing construction work to go back. That's already allowed in England, but in Scotland it must be in accordance with an industry-wide plan. And we know that schools and teachers can start preparations for a school opening, which won't be until the 11th of August in Scotland. Finally, in Wales, again, garden centres are already permitted to open, and we're expecting an announcement sometime today, I gather actually at 12:30 today, about what easing of the lockdown in terms of business Wales are planning. It's not going to be any more ambitious than England. It's probably going to be a bit behind England because they're delayed. Apologies, we didn't get the webinar at the right time to catch that announcement, but essentially watch out for that, and obviously we'll cover it off at the next webinar. So I hope that sets out the position in some detail.
Thanks, Nick. Let's look at the furlough scheme or the job retention scheme. How long can a business continue to claim 80% through the government's JRS?
Yeah, that's a very easy question to answer, because Rishi Sunak has already set this out. And we know that the current version of the job retention scheme will extend until the 31st of July. We know that, he set that out. And obviously you can see that in terms of the proposed business reopening timetable in England, that seems to allow ample time for that furlough scheme to continue until those other sectors are allowed to reopen. However, we are expecting a formal announcement today from the Chancellor on the extension to the scheme between the beginning of August and the end of October. The other point we do know is that the Chancellor is intending closing the furlough scheme to new entrants at some point, either on or before the 31st of July. So that's one to watch out for as well. As I say, we're waiting for detailed statements on the proposals for the forward-looking furlough scheme anytime now.
I know you've said you're waiting for detailed proposals, but we have had a question about, you know, if you've got staff and you're rotating them, say as part of a team on furlough, and you know you're aiming to have, with your forward planning, you're aiming to have people on furlough between August and October. Do these staff need to be furloughed now, as in before the 31st of July?
Well, that is a really good point, and we need to watch out for exactly what the Chancellor says, and we're expecting a detailed announcement today. We know that furlough at the moment needs to be for a minimum period of 3 weeks, and we know that there are some businesses that are basically operating at maybe half capacity and having people 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, and another team 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, or 3 weeks off, 3 weeks on. That sort of thing's happening. So you may find that there's a cohort of staff that's currently working that you're expecting to put on furlough at some point in the future. Well, under the current rules, furlough needs to be for a minimum of 3 weeks, and we know it's going to be closed to new entrants. So we don't know whether people who have been on furlough before count as new entrants. My suspicion is that they may count as new entrants, and that really employers need to watch out for that. I mean, we will be putting more information about this as and when we get it on our Coronavirus Hub on Mentor Live. Keep an eye out on that. There's frequently asked questions there on the furlough scheme that we keep bang up to date. That's the place to go if you want up-to-date information after this webinar.
Thanks, Nick. Edwina, can I come to you now and ask a question that we get asked a lot, and it's coming through again on the Q&A stream. When you've got staff on furlough, how much notice do business owners need to give people to actually come back to work?
Hi, Helen. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think it's important to remember that whilst any member of staff is on furlough, the contract of employment withstands. So really, individuals should be ready to return at any given point unless they're taking a period of leave. What I would say is that it's best practice to keep staff up to date during any period of furlough with regular communication. Obviously, let them know when their likely return date would be. So absolutely keep those channels open. And I think it's a good opportunity as well to also let them know about any changes that you've made to the workplace, any rules they'll need to abide by, and any other procedures that you're putting into place. So I think really the key thing here is just to make sure that you're keeping in communication with staff. It shouldn't come as any real surprise to them in terms of when they're returning.
Okay, thanks for that. And back to Nick now. Can I bring all of my office staff back now, as long as they're not vulnerable, or is there a government timeline when all home workers can go back into work again?
Yeah, we're getting lots of questions here about office staff. Now, in all 3 countries of the United Kingdom, sorry, we do exclude Northern Ireland in the advice we give because we don't have any business base there. But in all three, England, Scotland and Wales, both the law and the guidance remains that if you can work from home, you must do so. And in terms of the plans that have been published, really office people who can work from home, which generally speaking would be office workers who can work remotely, must remain working from home, and there really aren't any plans for that to be lifted. So there's only this really issue about whether some employees who are working from home really need to be in the office because they're just not at all effective working from home. Their work can't really properly be done from home. But at the moment, if you can work from home, you must do so. And say the rationale behind that is to ease the strain on public transport, which I think is where a lot of the sort of infections come, where people are touching handrails and in close proximity. And so that's the rationale behind it. So there is no plan to release that anytime soon.
Okay, and then again, back to the furlough scheme. When will business owners have to start part contributing, and do we know how much this is going to be? Okay,
well, the Chancellor's already announced. What we do know is that it will be restructured from the 1st of August. So it'll run as it is now until the 31st of July. And the scheme is expected to close completely on the 31st of October. We are expecting a formal announcement today of the details, but there has been an amount of information floated in the press, which, as I say, this is not definite, but it's in the press. And what they're suggesting is that furloughed workers will be able to work part-time and still be on furlough for the rest of the time. So that addresses one of the current issues we're seeing with the scheme, that employers have some work for people to do, but if they get them back, they have to take them off furlough completely. So that is definitely going to happen. But we don't know whether there's going to be any limit on how much part-time work they can do and so on. Follows from that the employer has to pay 100% of the wages for the hours the worker's working. Obviously, they'll need to pay them at least the minimum wage for the hours they're working, and their normal pay would cover that. We think for the balance of the hours, so say someone is brought back on a sort of 40% basis, they're working 40% of their hours. For the other 60%, the employee would continue to be on furlough, but the HMRC will only refund a figure less than the 80% that they're funding now. And the figure's been floated is 60%. Say we do not know as of this minute whether that is the figure, but it's going to be a figure less than 80%. We know that it's going to be less than 80% because the Chancellor has said that employers must share the burden. Key thing here is that employers won't be able to reduce their workers' pay down to 60% to match that contribution, because the furlough scheme will insist that the employers still continue to pay 80%. So as you can see, there's going to be a shortfall over and above the situation now. As I say, we will give you information as soon as we get it on the Mentor COVID hub about this, because say we are expecting a detailed announcement anytime soon. But that's the situation as I understand it now.
Okay, so that aside, what if as a business I can't afford to part contribute towards the wages?
Well, it's a fair question. To say that the current scheme goes on until the end of July. But businesses with staff on furlough really do need to start thinking about, their cash flow and their future business model now. It seems that economists think it's unfortunately increasingly unlikely, and anyone can see this, that the business is going to bounce back on a sort of V-shaped recovery, and we're just going to go back to how the situation was with just this blip for COVID. It looks really that the business won't bounce back quickly, and it may bounce back in a different shape. And we know that the proposed change to the furlough scheme will make it more expensive for employers to retain their staff, even if they have them back on some part-time basis. So employers do need to consider and take advice on some forms of structural change. They need to look at their business models and think, well, look, can we afford this? Is this sustainable? And there are options here. That it could include renegotiating staff terms and conditions, although again, in many sectors, the room for manoeuvre on that is very limited because of the national minimum wage. And we also know that because the national minimum wage has increased so much as a percentage term over recent years, actually employers have done an awful lot of the sort of cost cutting to accommodate that already. So there may not be much more sort of fat, if you like, to trim. But you may need to look at permanently reducing headcount. What you do need to do is take early advice on these sorts of things. Don't let it take you by surprise, because even where you're considering reducing permanent headcount, you do have an obligation to consult staff on your proposals, and there are penalties to pay if you don't in the employment tribunal. So it's really important to plan and involve your clients involve your staff in your plan, but also to take advice if you're thinking about any of that sort of thing.
Thanks, Nick. And the fact that you've started talking about redundancies has prompted a number of questions to come up on the Q&A stream. So Edwina, I'm going to turn to you and ask you some questions about redundancies, if that's okay. A couple, if I may. Can we still make use of the furlough scheme? Or if we can still make use of the furlough scheme, are we able to consider redundancies? And can we, and the sort of supplementary question to that is, can we use the furlough scheme as part of the redundancy notice period?
Yeah, thanks for that, Helen. So you can, but I think, really we need to remember that the aim of the job retention scheme is to try and retain as many jobs as possible. So I think really here businesses need to plan, well, they need to balance the need to plan with also utilising the scheme until maybe their position becomes a bit clearer. So I think it's really trying to tread that fine line between making sure that you are planning, but actually, it might not be, fully clear at this stage how, some of these changes are going to, be affecting your business. And I think, as Nick's already mentioned there, actually, as a step before that, businesses might want to look at, are they able to change things like hours, pay, benefits as a step, short of having to make redundancies. But unfortunately, I think ultimately a lot of businesses are in this position where they're needing to consider this right now. So in answer to your question, businesses can consult with staff whilst they're on furlough. That is permitted. We would just want to call out that businesses will need to be aware of any minimum periods of consultation if 20 or more people are affected. So yes is the answer, but really, it does need to be a true last resort. I mean, in terms of the notice period, can furlough be used as part of that notice? Again, yes, that would be possible. The employer would just need to be aware that they would need to potentially top up the employee's pay so that they're receiving their normal rate of pay during any period of notice.
Okay, thank you. So that's also then prompted a number of questions around holiday, and I know we get this every week, so if you don't mind, would you mind going back over again? Can an employer force employees or staff to take annual leave during furlough?
Yes, so yes, you can. The starting point would be, an employer can certainly ask staff to take leave, and hopefully they would agree to that. But if they don't, you can still enforce that a certain amount of leave is taken by giving twice as much notice as the leave itself. So, for example, giving 2 weeks' notice for one week's worth of leave. The government has relaxed the working time regulations to allow the carryover of annual leave where it's not been possible to take it. But I think for many businesses, it will be possible to take that leave. So I think really the advice here is for employers to consider how they are managing annual leave as part of their business planning initiatives. And that's really important to make sure that staff have, one, has sufficient rest, but two, that the employers, they're not having large amounts of annual leave to contend with trying to fit in or carry over into subsequent leave years. So really taking a proactive approach to the management of annual leave is going to be important.
Thanks, Edwina, and apologies if you covered this in your answer, but I just wanted a little bit more clarity about if staff do take annual leave during furlough, what are they actually paid?
Yes, this is a good question. They would need to receive their normal rate of pay for the leave. So if they're currently receiving, 80%, or indeed that's capped, then that would need to be topped up. So they are receiving their normal rate of pay for the time off.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying that, because I covered at least half a dozen questions on the Q&A stream. Nick, I'm going to come back to you now, because we've had a dozen or so questions asking about employees where you are asking them to come back into work, but what happens if they refuse?
Yes, well, we're getting a lot of that on our advice service as well. And I think that it is understandable, bearing in mind the government's message. And there's also issues here around shielding employees, which I'll cover. First point is it's important to ensure that your workplace is actually COVID secure, and you've done the appropriate risk assessments, which my colleague Pete will happily talk to you about if needed. Where you're doing that and assuring safe workplace, then it's important that you will have already involved your staff in suggesting the sort of measures they're like to put in place to ensure social distancing. I think it's really important, actually. A lot of the issues here we have are where people don't feel they've been involved in the process, just being imposed on them, and where they feel that they've been involved in devising those and understand what the government guidance is and understand what the employer's doing. And they can make useful suggestions, and the employer can adapt, of course. You're much less likely to then get the pushback when you say you've got to come back to work now. Of course, if where you do get issues, we'd always recommend that you try to speak to the employee individually and actually understand their individual concerns. And that will also give you the opportunity to say what you've put in place. Now, we have had quite a few questions here about shielding this morning. And the shielding point is that you can claim furlough for employees who've been told to shield, but the initial shielding period, I think, was sort of 13 weeks. And I think there was something on the radio this morning about shielded employees saying that we've been completely forgotten about. Essentially, that continues to apply. There hasn't been any, oh, well, it's the end of 13 weeks now, you're not required to shield anymore, you've got to come back to work. That still continues to apply. Shielded employees, it's just going on, well, for want of a better word, indefinitely. So where you have shielded employees, you clearly can continue to furlough those at least until the end of July. Beyond that, there are employees who maybe haven't had the shielding letter, but who do have disabilities or vulnerabilities, possibly including pregnancy, where they still won't feel safe in the work environment. So it's important to discuss that with them, try and understand what their concerns. First point, obviously, is always to see if the work can be done from home. That's always the first port of call. If not, if all of that fails and you still feel that the employee's being unreasonable and that they don't have actually what you perceive as a legitimate reason for continuing to stay away from the workplace, to be honest, at that point, I think it's best to take specific advice on that, because there are a lot of ins and outs with employment law about, discrimination and so on. You've got to be really, really careful that you're not seen to be doing things that could result in some form of claim. So those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. Good advice there. I want to move away from furlough and holiday because we could spend a whole 45 minutes talking about it, I'm sure. But I want to move on to the panel's views of what is the current position on testing if we're thinking about opening up offices and workplaces again. There's been a lot of conversation about testing. So Pete, from a health and safety perspective, I'm going to come to you and ask for your guidance on this.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, just to clarify the current position on testing then, and forgive me if I read through this a little bit. So if you're in England, Scotland or Wales, and you have any of the symptoms of coronavirus, and obviously you can check the symptom checker on the NHS website. If you've got any symptoms, you can book a test or order a test through the NHS website now. And again, depending on where you live in the UK, the various government links and websites will take you to the right place to get that test and to get it arranged. So that's if you're symptomatic, irrespective of anything else really. Again, essential workers continue to get a priority access to testing. Again, you can go to the same links. Well, actually, it's a different link for priority testing. So those people that are sort of designated as being essential workers, such as teachers, frontline staff, and many other people. And again, you can check the definitions. I'm sure most people probably know if they're an essential worker or not now. You can get a priority test there as well. And again, anyone in England, Scotland or Wales who is over 5 years old and has symptoms of coronavirus and lives with an essential worker, they can also get tested as well. Okay, and there's a slight difference there in England, so that actually applies to under 5-year-olds as well. So even under 5-year-olds living in a household with an essential worker can get tested. Everywhere else, in Wales and Scotland, it will be over 5-year-olds. So that's quite useful to know as well. And just thinking about the care sector now, so for people who are working in the care sector and who are working with older residents or residents with dementia, then anyone who's a worker or is a resident in one of those types of homes can also have a test and order a test, irrespective of whether they've got any symptoms or not. So again, that's a priority for the care sector for obvious reasons. And again, you can either go direct to the NHS website to go to the right links to book these tests, or you can go through the government portals and it'll direct you in the right direction.
Thanks, Pete. We've been asked by so many people, both through the email and also this morning, about test and trace. So, you know, what do you know about it? What can you tell us about it? What advice are you giving?
Yes, I suppose, like a lot of these things, the confusing thing at the moment is different areas of the UK have got different timings and different things, and even different names for these things. So test and trace, as it's called in England, and test and protect in Scotland. These are systems that are both up and running now, and the Welsh version will be up and running from Monday. So essentially, all of these systems are very similar, and it's a system to trace the people who have come into contact with someone that's been tested positive for coronavirus. So we've got thousands of people out there now that have been recruited across the UK and are responsible for contacting people. So once someone's had a positive test, people they've come into contact with, and that's sort of the different parameters of this, but generally if you come into contact with someone for 15 minutes or more within 2 meters of them, then you're a potential contact there. So you will be contacted. It might be by text, by phone, by email, and then I'm given to understand that you'd be required to log into a website then, and then to take that further. But you'll probably end up being on the phone and sort of discussing who your contacts have been, who your close contacts have been in the last few days. So that's potentially going to be work colleagues and almost certainly people within your house. So this is obviously a fairly new system that's only just being tested now. It's new technology, new systems, and we'll just have to wait to see how it goes really. But obviously this will have ramifications for our business customers. Just to give a little bit more information on that then, basically, if you do get symptoms, you'll need to contact the NHS directly and apply for a test. Once you've tested, or if you test negative, then you and your household no longer need to self-isolate. So that's one point there. If you test positive, you will need to self-isolate for 7 days, and your contacts again will be contacted through a contact tracing system. So that's the basics of how it will work. I don't know if Edwina would like to just pick up on any of those points, or Nick.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it all very well. I think just one point that might be worth noting is that the test and trace system, this is completely separate to the app that's being currently trialled in the Isle of Wight. So really this test and trace system, this is for anybody who has tested positive, and obviously the teams will be contacting people who have been in close proximity to anyone who's tested positive to really try and reduce the R rate. So just think that that's something that's worth noting, that this system is separate to what's being trialled elsewhere.
Yes, sorry, and that picks up on one or two of the questions we've had. I think it's intended to incorporate the app later, but at the moment that the starting point is a positive test result. And I suppose you can begin to see that actually, if you're in close contact with an anonymous individual who you don't know the name and telephone number of, well, clearly those people aren't going to be traced through the current system, because there's no way of you knowing who they are. Just a couple of points on the sort of how this works for an employer. This is going to be covered, payment for this, under the statutory sick pay scheme. And you'll remember that statutory sick pay was extended such that there were no longer the waiting days, the first 3 days where people don't get anything. So it's intended where people are asked to sort of self-isolate because of this, that they would get SSP, and the employer can claim that back through an online portal that was launched, I think, only during the last week, just for this, reclaiming this SSP. An online isolation note is sufficient evidence for them. So the individual gets an isolation note saying they've been asked to isolate. They can email that to their employer. The employer then can put them through 14 days SSP. A hole in this system, I think, is the issue of, well, what if someone is asked to isolate because they've been in contact, and then they're asked to isolate again? They get back to work, and then they're a sociable sort of person. They've got to do it again, and it does appear that the SSP rebate scheme only applies for one lot of 14 days. So we need to watch and see whether the government puts in place any other financial support over and above SSP, because you can certainly see that some individuals who have just been contacted via the contact tracing app that don't have symptoms themselves won't respond kindly to being told that they've got to stay away from the workplace for 14 days on SSP. And that seems to be a weak link of the system. That's my thoughts.
Thanks for pointing that out, Nick. Actually, it's a really valid point. But so we've got a couple more COVID-19 testing scenarios to put to you. Edwina, can I force somebody to have a COVID test and send them home or discipline them if they refuse?
Yeah, I think this question is really going to depend on your business circumstances, really. I mean, clearly, as Pete and Nick have already talked about, there are provisions in place for all essential workers to take a test. And clearly in a care home setting, whether someone is symptomatic or not, it's going to be important to be able to test individuals, because to obviously stop the spread and protect the vulnerable. So I think in those circumstances it would be reasonable to ensure that people are taking those tests in order to ensure that people are protected. But I think really the focus does need to be on making sure all of the government guidance is followed. So reminding staff that if they are symptomatic, they will be required to self-isolate. If they're living with someone who is symptomatic, again, they'll be required to self-isolate. And clearly, if they've been contacted because they've been in close proximity with somebody who's tested positive, then again, they will need to adhere to the guidelines around self-isolating. So I think really that's where the focus should be. For any non-essential workers, I think businesses can absolutely encourage staff to take a test, but I think from an employment law perspective, it's going to be difficult to enforce them, because we've got all kinds of challenges with the need to consent and right to a private life. So disciplining, I think, would be not necessarily recommended. But I think with any of these specific kind of questions, it's really best to seek advice so that you're getting the right information for your business circumstances.
Thanks, Edwina. I'm going to turn to Pete and Nick on this next one. So it's a combination of two scenarios, really, where we all come back to work and we're in the workplace. If we've had some kind of test and trace, or somebody is showing symptoms, particularly if we've got a small business, do we have to? Does everybody have to self-isolate? Have we got to shut the business down again? I mean, it feels like it could be an absolute nightmare.
That's a fair question, which I think is on a lot of business owners' minds at the moment, actually. And I mean, I suppose the easy answer is there's no immediate requirement to shut down and shut up shop, because one person has, potentially sort of has the symptoms. So I think for me, from a health and safety point of view, it would be just to look at the COVID-19 risk assessment that I've completed already. And obviously that's a legal requirement now to have that risk assessment. I'd look at my risk controls really carefully and just see if there's anything else I can do to improve the situation. I think it's one of those risk assessments where it's going to be tweaked almost every week as guidance changes and as you learn from this new way of working. So you're going to keep that document up to date. You're going to keep discussing it with staff, consult with them regularly and get their input. That's going to be very important. And for me, I think it's going to be quite important to have in that risk assessment the fact that staff, if you possibly can, they don't come within 2 meters of each other at any period of time. Now that will be possible for some businesses, it won't be for others. But if you've got that in your risk assessment, you can stick to it, and you can demonstrate that you've made that information available to your staff and that you've trained them on it, then you've got a very good defence there, and you're already working along the government guidelines around this in case someone is required to isolate. So I think that's the way to look at it, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just reinforce that point. What we certainly don't want to happen is for the whole workplace to be closed down because someone has said, oh, well, all my contacts that I've been within 2 meters of for more than 15 minutes are in the workplace. So employers do need to revisit those risk assessments to make absolutely sure that people are adequately spaced around when doing their duties, and just to have a look at exactly what the definition is of a contact. And as I say, as Edwina said, this isn't the same as someone who's had an app, the app ring or whatever. This is someone who's been with them for close than 2 meters for more than 15 minutes. So again, if you think of a workplace, it may be that people do sort of go close than that for very brief periods, but that wouldn't count as a close contact. So it's really important to look at the workplace. Other ways of mitigating against that risk, I think, are having sort of cohorts of workers. So for the slightly larger employers where you have 2 groups of staff doing the same job, but they're in different locations or whatever, and you don't mix and match people within that, so that effectively if one whole cohort has to go off because of this test and trace, the other cohort is able to continue working. But really, I think key is getting the health and safety right. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. Look, let's turn now, because I'm conscious that we've spent a lot of time on testing and that sort of thing, but can we turn now to getting ready for work? So Pete, what are the must-dos for businesses to get their staff ready and back to work?
Yeah, okay. It's an important question, and we have covered it, with clients a lot really over the last few weeks. So it's a reasonably simple answer, in all honesty. I think it's just planning ahead, getting started early, get as much information as you can out there. So download the relevant sort of working safely guidance that's been produced by the government in the last sort of couple of weeks. Speak to your trade bodies, your professional bodies, get that information, consult with staff early, and build your COVID-19 risk assessment as you're doing that. And by the way, we've got a completed example on Mentor Live you can download straight away and just adapt that to suit you. So that really is the key thing, really, is making us an early start on things. And just find out, do you need to order perspex screens? Do you need extra signage? Do you need floor marking tape? Do you need your normal PPE that you normally use if you're working in a dusty environment? Or do you wear gloves or that type of thing? PPE is going to be a little bit more difficult to get hold of, so you need to make sure you order that well in advance. And some of the bigger stockists have ring-fenced it, so you might need to be a bit more creative about getting that in. So that's I think that's an important point as well. And just be flexible and adaptable and keep updating your procedures.
I think just to add on to that from an employment law perspective, I think, to touch on what you've already mentioned there, communicating with staff at an early stage is really going to be key, and really just communicating with them around the work that needs to be completed. It may be that objectives might need to change. There may need to be a bit of an element of retraining if the direction or focus of work is shifted slightly. So I think that's certainly things to think about. And then I think the last thing is also just to consider how best to support staff as well, because many staff, will be facing, a whole number of different challenges, whether it's, caring for others in their household or other difficulties. I think it's been reported that over 50% of people have struggled with their mental health at some point during this crisis. And I think that's really important for employers to be aware of that when you do return to work, there may need to be increased line manager support. So really thinking about what that looks like in your organisation. I think those are all really important points as part of that getting ready to return back to work plan.
Thanks, Edwina. Really good points to consider. I'm going to jump now to, you've mentioned, Pete, already about risk assessments. I know it is one of your favourite phrases. But is it true that my business needs a coronavirus risk assessment and that I've got to publish it?
Yeah, so there's been new guidance issued in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I think it is on this now. So I suppose just to reiterate the point, there is a requirement in the UK to have a coronavirus risk assessment. It's really up to you how you set that out. There are various templates that you can use. Again, I'll go back to the Mentor Live. There's a version on there for you. You could build the risk assessment into your existing risk assessments, or you can just start with a completely new one. It's entirely up to you. But there is a bit of government guidance on this, and what they've actually said is, if possible, you should consider publishing the results on your website, and we would expect all employers with over 50 workers to do so. So it's a bit of a strange one, really. It's not normal health and safety law. But I think it doesn't literally mean you have to publish your risk assessment onto your website, but perhaps you put the key outcomes on there, so the key points from your risk assessment. And you could use this as an opportunity to actually sell your company as well. So you can put the details, notify your customers, in particular, what your new controls are in terms of coming into your workplace, and visitors as well, so that they know in advance. I've noticed on a number of client websites they've been doing this and putting coronavirus information on there. I think it's a really good idea, and it just shows you're ahead of the game as well.
Yeah, thanks for Pete. I think it is a really good idea. Let's just flip back to when we're all back in the workplace. We can put into place 2 metre distancing and all the other bits and pieces, but let's not forget we've got a number of people who are first aiders. Can you sort of give us a bit of guidance around first aiders and a bit more about PPE, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so in terms of first aid, I think what some employees might find is, they may have their regular first aider, or their first aiders might not be able to come into work if they're self-isolating or if they're ill. So it's going to be a need to just review your first aid risk assessment around that, just to determine you've got enough first aid cover on site. I mean, potentially the HSE have talked about maybe you could share a first aider with a neighbouring company. If you've got similar risks, that's a possibility. The other thing to note as well is that some people's first aid certificates may have expired in this period of lockdown. So what the HSE have said is that if your first aid certificate has expired after the 16th of just check my facts here, after the 16th of March, and you're finding it difficult to get requalification training, even online training, then there's a period of grace for that as well, up until the end of September. So that may go on a little bit, that period of grace for England and Scotland, but in England, in Wales, in England certainly it's been set as the 30th. So you've got some an extra period of grace there. In terms of additional guidance for first aiders, I think the best thing is probably to consult with your first aid trainer. I've noticed that some of the big providers like St John Ambulance and British Red Cross have given some additional guidance on what their first aiders can and can't do in the coronavirus or pandemic, around sort of keeping a distance and additional PPE. So rather than going into that in detail, I would just have a look, and again, St John's Ambulance or Red Cross or your other training provider, or the HSE website. In fact, I've got some information on that as well.
Thanks, Pete. And a number of questions have come through, so I really do feel that we need to cover it. I want the panel's opinion on the pitfalls and options around temperature testing, please.
I'm happy to kick that one off if you like, Helen. Yes, I've noticed, and I know some of our clients are using temperature testing. I think typically the bigger companies are using it at the moment. Interestingly, it's not mentioned in any of the government guidance that's been produced for working safely. So it's not really considered by the government to be one of those sort of key risk controls, I suppose. They will say in their guidance that we're still looking at social distancing, 2 metre rule, use of barriers, regular hand washing services, that type of thing. So the pitfalls are with it, to my mind, is you would need to have the right equipment, you need to have the right training, it would need to be calibrated, and you couldn't really rely on it as being 100% sort of guarantee that someone hasn't got coronavirus, because some people are asymptomatic and they don't have a raised temperature. So there's all sorts of pitfalls just from a health and safety point of view.
Yeah, I mean, from an employment law point of view, I think, again, we see all these sorts of things happening, but we need to understand the sort of effect on the employment relationship here. A few issues. This is sensitive personal data, it's health data. So of course you need to have a lawful basis for collecting it, and just getting consent, well, the employee may feel they're in no position but to consent. That's unlikely to be enough. There can be other reasons that people may have a temperature other than COVID, and of course you may be finding out information about them that they don't necessarily want to disclose to you when you ask them, well, why have you got a temperature? In other circumstances, alcohol and drugs testing, they're sort of safety critical industries, and that's always introduced with provision in the contract of employment, a clear policy behind it. So if you're going to introduce it, I'd suggest that you need something like that. And finally, the final thing to consider is, well, what are you going to do if you discover someone's got a high temperature? You're going to send them home, because if they presented ready, willing and able to work, they may expect to be paid. And that's quite a big issue if you're sending people home, either unpaid or saying, no, it's statutory sick pay. You may find that they would want to claim wages off you. So I wouldn't be recommending people introduce that, certainly without having taken detailed advice on what they need to put in place to introduce it. I'm not saying rule it out completely, but I think you don't just feel that's a panacea for this.
Thanks, Nick. I know that a number of people have been asking throughout this latest webinar about where can they get hold of the risk assessments, and can they get hold of a transcript of this webinar. So by registering for today's webinar, actually you will shortly be sent a follow-up email which will give you loads of useful website links, including a link to the Mentor website. And if you click on the Coronavirus Read More button, you can register to use Mentor Live, which is our e-system, and that is free of charge to you. We also offer a 3-month advice service, which is chargeable, and if you want to know more about any of our services, our contact details are available on the Mentor website. But by logging into Mentor Live and using the dedicated coronavirus section, you will have full access to the frequently asked questions. There are risk assessment templates, there are letters around furlough, loads and loads of resources that are available there for you. And you'll also find the registration links to our weekly sessions, as well as the links to the recordings, which can also be found on the NatWest YouTube channel. So for this afternoon, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge, and to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you.
The recording has stopped.